I'd like to welcome onto the stage now the Executive Chairman of EM+, Lord Barker of Battle. A round of applause, please, for Lord Barker. Hello there.
Hi, Emma.
Nice to see you, Greg. Do
Thank
come
you.
and take a seat. How are you doing?
Good. Well, we're nearly there, aren't we?
Does it feel a bit like that?
It does feel a little bit like someone's ringing the bell at the end of a marathon.
And it's been a good, productive Davos for you?
It has. It really has. I have been coming to Davos for over a decade, not every year, but I think I first came in 2008 and was talking climate change then, and pretty much that's been my theme all the times I've been since. But something really felt different about this year. And I don't think it's just wishful thinking on my part. It really did feel that there'd been a sort of avalanche of interest in the low-carbon climate change agenda, with finance, with civil society, with companies, businesses, and I think probably governments are perhaps at the back of that queue. But it definitely did feel, in all the different moderated discussions on the chats I've had on the promenade, it feels like this is taken seriously with a sense of urgency, that it's no longer a nice sort of optional fringe event to drop into. Actually, this is something which all big CEOs, finance directors, investing institutions are really actually quite anxious about how they should now be responding.
Which must come as a big relief for you, if you've been talking about it for the past 10 years. Finally, someone's listening.
To be relevant.
And you are very passionate. I mean, you've been in the energy market as well as politics for a very long time. Why are you so passionate about this?
Well, I guess it's because it's one of the few things that I know quite a bit about. But I started getting interested in this when I first entered Parliament. I'd worked in the energy business in the 90s, but it wasn't really an issue. It's only when I first went into Parliament and was encouraged to look at one particular issue to make myself useful, and I alighted on environmental issues. And this was just at the time that Al Gore was first starting to talk about climate change, having lost the presidential race. And for me, the issue really came alive. And because I had a business background, I could get my head around it. It wasn't the fluffiest end of the environmental spectrum. And to me, it just seemed an absolute call to action. And the more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that not only did we have to act, but that if we acted in time, we could do something about this. It wasn't a hopeless cause. And in many ways, a lot of the things that we needed to do were in themselves good. I'm an optimist by nature. And I've always been optimistic about the solutions to climate change. And at last, there seems to be some evidence coming forward that justifies 10 years of optimism.
Let's talk about aluminium now. An amazing metal, something that's changed all our lives, hasn't it, really? We use it every day. We probably don't even realise that we're using it. But it is a polluter, isn't it? It is one of the 7 sectors of being hard to abate that the UN has labelled. Give us a rundown of its kind of credentials, where it is right now.
Well, aluminium is a fascinating metal. It is a building block of the low-carbon economy. Something like 70% of all the aluminium that's been produced in the industrial age is still in circulation. So it was going round before anyone even thought of the circular economy. If you chuck a Coke can into the trash, it can take less than 8 weeks before that can be back on a supermarket shelf, as opposed to plastics, which in 8 weeks' time are probably floating somewhere in the Southern Ocean. So it's certainly sustainable in terms of recycling credentials.
What about making it?
However, that's the big thing. Its dirty little secret is that actually, because it's so energy intensive to make aluminium, the energy source that you use makes a profound difference to the carbon content. Now, as you can guess from these pictures behind us, the N+ Group, we're not only a large producer, the largest outside China of aluminium, we're also the world's largest hydropower company in the private sector. So over 16 gigawatts of hydro. To put that in context, that's more electricity than is produced by all of Great Britain's nuclear reactors put together, coming from our hydro plants on Lake Baikal. So with this huge, clean source of electricity, we're making this metal. As a result, our carbon content of our aluminium is not low enough, but it's only about 2.5 to 3 tons of carbon to make 1 ton of aluminium. Unfortunately, the majority of the world's aluminium, which particularly comes from China using coal-fired electricity, can be up to 18 tons or higher. So 18.3. I mean, and that's being generous. So it's a massive differential.
And if I'm a consumer and I want to buy that aluminium, how can I tell if it's
really
low carbon
difficult.
or not?
In fact, you can't at the moment. It's very, very difficult for consumers to make informed choices. But there's no point, lots of people are wanting to do the right thing, going to buy electric cars, wanting to use renewable energy, wanting to retrofit their house to make it more energy efficient. All of these things use aluminium, but it's very difficult for consumers to know whether they're using highly polluting, carbon-rich aluminium from one of the coal-fired sources or aluminium like ours, which is made ultimately from water.
Now, the London Metals Exchange, the LME, is the kind of the central market, isn't it, for your industry?
Yeah, it's the key price setter.
And you've given them a task, and you want them to do what? Explain
Absolutely.
to us.
So we've got to move. We've got to shift. The one thing we know now is that a clock is ticking, and there's a clear science pathway that we have to follow if we're going to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, and we've signed up to that. And if we're going to do that, you have to have the data, you have to have the metrics, and you have to get emissions down to a very clear science-based timetable. Now, in order to do that, the very first step is to understand how much carbon is in the metals that you're using, whether you're using that to build a Tesla or to make a Coke can or to use it in building products. At the moment, it's not visible at all. Now, we have a product called Allow, which is our product which people know is low carbon, but there isn't a clear asset class. There isn't a way, if you don't know about N+, of just being able to find out about the carbon content. So we want, very simple, we want the London Metal Exchange to put the carbon content of each trade on the ticket so people know. And we think that once you have that visibility, you will create a market in low carbon aluminium. And then we've got to bring down the threshold for what we define as low carbon aluminium, because ultimately we've got to get to net zero or even below. So
what kind of reaction have you had from LME and also from your competitors? Because everyone has to be in agreement, I'm assuming.
Well, I have to say, I'm relatively new to this sector, and it's a very conservative sector, and I don't mean that in a good way, as a former Conservative politician.
And now Lord.
People aren't opposed to this, but there are a lot of people who suck their teeth and don't want to move fast enough.
Why is that?
There's going to be disruption. I think if you want to characterize the low carbon economy in the last decade compared to the 20s, in the last decade, the narrative for business was, look, take these steps on climate, energy efficiency, other measures around resource efficiency. These are no regrets policies. Everyone will benefit. You should be doing them anyway. Actually, that low-hanging fruit has now been picked. If we're really to shift to a low-carbon economy, there will be disruption. There will be winners and losers. There will be prices to be paid. Certain sectors, certain businesses will go out of business. And I think some companies either don't want to face up to it or just want to put that off as long as possible. But again, as we keep hearing this week in Davos, there is a science-based timetable that not just my sector, but whole national economies have signed up to, and we've got to get our house in order. So I think the aluminium sector has a real opportunity because we're such an invaluable resource, if made correctly. We've got a real opportunity to help lead that low carbon transition. But if we just sit on our hands, then we could find ourselves a victim of it.
Some people who are resisting your idea suggest that maybe you're doing this to get a green premium.
I think green premium will come, and actually it's necessary, because even businesses like ours are going to have to invest millions, if not billions, in new technology, in new infrastructure, in capital equipment, because we're not going to sit still. In order to get to net zero, we're investing in R&D, but that R&D into something called inert anode technology to produce net zero aluminium, to scale that up is going to cost billions if you actually want to replace old smelters with state-of-the-art 21st technology. That's going to take money. And to do that, that's going to ultimately come from consumers. It's going to come from investors. But the really exciting thing is when I talk to investors, they get it. I think they get it much more than many of the companies that they're invested in. And so I think that combination of pressure from the street, pressure from the consumer, pressure from investors and the equity markets, I think finances, banks are waking up to this, and then ultimately governments. And this is the year of COP26. We're going to be hearing a lot more about climate change, particularly in the UK this year. I think all of these factors together mean that you just can't resist these forces. It's not a question if, it's just when.
I wanted to ask you about government, because that's the one group we haven't talked about yet. Of course, within the Conservative government for a long time as Energy Minister. I think you're the longest serving, is that right?
I was indeed, yeah, so far.
So you know your onions when it comes to that. And we've had President Trump coming up onto the mountain here, whether you agree with him or not. What is it you want to see from global leaders? I mean, what needs to be in place for businesses to do what they need to do? Well,
actually, I don't mean to crow, and it's all credit to Boris Johnson and his government, and actually even Theresa May. I want them to follow the UK's example. The UK has signed up already to legally binding targets to get to net zero economy by 2050. Now,
is that soon enough?
I think it's a very, very big ambition, but we're making progress already. I don't know if people here realise how far the UK has decarbonised already. Based from 1992, despite the growth in the economy since then, emissions in the UK are already down by about 45%. In fact, we now emit less carbon than at any time since 1892. So they have been able to bend the curve. Obviously, the higher you go, the more difficult it gets. But we've passed in the UK a legally binding statute that obliges successive governments to keep going towards net zero. And we need that to be something that really comes out of COP26 with other economies signing up to that, and for emerging economies in the global south to sign up to peaking emissions and then joining in that low carbon economy.
Yeah, it's a great landmark, isn't it? Let's get back to N+. What is your next step then in your quest to get this stamp, if you will?
Well, I don't think I'm not wedded to any one specific policy mechanism or intervention, because there are lots of good ideas. We're going to need lots of different interventions and initiatives to get this done. But I do think that LME is a great starting place. And I think it's just common sense. It's good sense to have the carbon labelling, carbon transparency on these crucial metals that are traded. And I know there's a lot of goodwill.
There's a working group.
There's a working group. There are other. It's not just us that are calling for it. And I think there are a number of big and small companies that are now actively considering this. And it's, as I said, it's not that they're against it, but it's just happening perhaps a little quicker than is outside their comfort zone. But one thing I keep hearing in Davos this week is that the challenge to CEOs and corporate leaders to get outside their comfort zone, to think about the actions they're planning to take, and then move a little bit further to the edge of their seat. Because it's going to take all of that and more if we're going to be really serious about tackling climate change.
And we'll carry on with that theme in our wider panel in just a few minutes' time, because it's a really interesting question. But just to finish with you, Lord Barker, so low carbon, what about carbon neutral?
Exactly, that's where we've got to get to. So I think this decade, the 2020s, I've just been with the Secretary General, and that is what he's terming the decade of action. So if we were talking about it in the last decade, we really have to make this the decade of action. But if that's low carbon, when we get into the 2030s and 2040s, we've got to start, industries have to get to net zero in order for the whole economy to reach net zero by 2050.
So when can you produce aluminium that is carbon neutral?
Well, we're already doing it in small batches in Russia right now. And Russia, of course, has an amazing deep science base that we can draw upon and set to work to the climate agenda. But we're already doing this at N+, but what we need to do is work further to bring it to commercial scale. So the technology is already there, and what we're now we're in a more since the governance reforms that I put in, we're opening up to partnerships with other companies around the world to share our expertise and sort of join us on this mission.
Okay, do you have a date in mind?
Mid-2020s, sooner the better in my book.